get started a little bit late. And also because some young people are working and everything, we've been taping the sessions in case people miss a session here or there. Well, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I hope so. It's a real delight today to be joined by the Guardian journalist Amelia Gentleman, who's very well known for her work on the Windrush. She's waving. And also Rachael Venables, who works for LBC, which is a terrific radio station that has a range of fantastic presenters, including David Lammy, for whom some of you is your MP. And it's just lovely to have you all on the call. And I hope you enjoyed yesterday's session. Put a thumbs up if you enjoyed yesterday's day. Good. Glad to see there's people who enjoyed it. That's good. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask maybe Rachael, I'll go with you first on the radio side of things, and then Amelia secondly on the writing side of things and her experience doing the Windrush. So a little bit of an outline of how you got to be journalists, a little bit on life of a journalist, and a little bit on maybe a special topic of yours, and maybe speak for 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll just do Q&A and wind up at about 45. That's what I said yesterday, and we ended up going through till 59 because we were talking about policing and it got us all interested. But could I start with you, Rachael, on your contribution? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you've just told a radio journalist to speak for 7 to 8 minutes, so hopefully I'll do it to the second. But yeah, no, it's lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for inviting me. And, you know, it's a real honour even just to be invited to something like this alongside Amelia as well. I'm also really excited to hear what she has to say. But you wanted me to start, first of all, by how I got into journalism. It started at university. I studied history and English literature. I actually wanted to be maybe a teacher, maybe a historian, but I sort of by chance stumbled into the university radio station at my university. And I went along to a session. My housemate at the time wanted to do student radio, and I thought, yeah, it's a bit different. You know, you sign up for all these different things. I also, you know, signed up to the television SOC. I signed up for all sorts of different projects I never saw again. But when I was in this lecture hall at university and they started to talk about the news team, the radio station, the shows they did, the bulletins they read, I just remember thinking, wow, that's really cool. Which maybe isn't the reaction everybody would have to radio news, but it did for me, and it really inspired me because nobody in my family, nobody in my background, really from my town, my school, ever would have gone into journalism or the media. So it didn't feel like something that was a route that I could ever take. And these students were here talking to me and saying, you know what, you can do it. And I joined and I loved it. And then I went on to do a Master's of Broadcast Journalism at the University of Sheffield, which was brilliant because that gave me all the training I needed, sort of hone my skills and the legal aspects of it. And then I started freelancing for a summer. I freelanced, it sort of fell into commercial radio really because my tutor knew that there were some shifts going at Capital in Leeds, Capital and Heart Radio, and she sort of pushed me into that. I did it and loved it. And then within a few months, I had a full-time job at Global Radio, who own LBC, also Heart, Capital, Classic, Smooth, all of these big radio stations. And I had a job for them in Milton Keynes. I was a newsreader for 2 years, all the while feeding into LBC, who of course is the sort of national big platform. And then 5 years ago, almost to the day, actually, I think I had an interview to come to LBC to be the national reporter, and since then I've been promoted to correspondent, so I'm now LBC and Global Radio's most senior reporter. And basically my day-to-day job is in some ways total chaos. It is different every single day, and it is mad and it is fun, and sometimes it's really frustrating, but mostly I love it because really my role is to respond to whatever the biggest breaking story of the day is, to get myself across it, to interview the right people, to get the clips, to be at the right location, and then just sort of explain it and sell it on air in a way that the listener will understand, and the way that, you know, it'll engage with them and telling them what they need to know. And that could be anything from covering a terror attack, a major crime story, to really light-hearted pieces. Some days it's a light, fun challenge that Nick Ferrari has dreamed up and it's bonkers and I'm running through London doing something silly, and other days it's, you know, a serious court report, it's something that really matters, or it's my own investigation. And that's something that LBC has been brilliant at, is they give me the freedom and the opportunity to chase down stories and do investigations and exclusives about stuff that I'm really passionate about. And I think that leads me on to the last point you mentioned, which is stories that I have done and focused on. And 4 years ago, in a summer that was just absolutely horrible for all the wrong reasons, 2017, I covered a series of terror attacks that summer and the Grenfell fire. You know, it was a series of weeks where I would get phone calls at 2 a.m. from my boss saying, you have to go here, you have to go there. But Grenfell in particular has always stuck with me. And I've been doing stories on that, on the inquiry, on the survivors, on the crisis ever since. And that's what led me last summer to start reporting on what we now know to be the real cladding crisis, or the building safety crisis, that I think perhaps was so little understood. And now finally there is enough media attention out there and political pressure that we appreciate that, you know, millions of people have been affected and are trapped in worthless homes. You know, they're facing bankruptcy, they're facing the most monumental mental health pressures. And it was thanks to LBC, the callers, the people who ran in with their own stories, and a few other media outlets in the early stages who really championed that story, who made it so that now what it is today, which is something that's in the mainstream and we all understand and know and appreciate, is something that needs to be fixed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. And before I introduced Amelia, just to say that she and I have somebody who we know in common called Eric Gordon, who sadly passed away earlier this year. And he was a very interesting editor of a local newspaper called the Camden New Journal, which had a branch when I was a borough leader next door. And he said to me about 2010, it's now 11 years ago, he said, have you heard of a journalist called Amelia Gentleman? She's amazing. So this was high praise from the sort of very old and experienced journalist. And then eventually I started following Amelia's work in The Guardian, and she's going to talk to you now about her work, which is very different from radio because it's written in a newspaper, but how you translate newspaper into today when people don't read newspapers as much, etc. So Amelia, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for telling me that about Eric, who died sadly a couple of months ago. And I'm a huge fan of the Camden Journal, and if any of you are in that part of London, it's really worth trying to get hold of. So I've been a journalist for 20 years now. I knew that I wanted to be a journalist. I think I was quite lucky that even at school it was something that I was really interested in. So I edited the school newspaper. When I went to university, I did some student journalism. I was a news editor of the paper that we had at university. I studied history and Russian, and I can't entirely explain now why I studied Russian, but it was a really interesting thing to do. And as a student, I went to live there for a while, and I worked on an English language newspaper whilst I was a student. I did after graduating, I did a postgraduate course in journalism, but I dropped out because I didn't like it. So that was not a kind of very glorious part of my education, because I only managed to do it for a term. But then I was a trainee with an organisation called the Press Association, which is a news agency that sends reporters around the country reporting on what's happening in Parliament or in the courts, or really quite locally. And that was a really good training. And then I started as a really junior reporter with The Guardian. I haven't stayed at The Guardian all that time. I've worked a lot of that time abroad. So I did work in Russia for a while, just as Putin became Prime Minister first and then President. And I've also worked in France and in India, working for other organisations. But for the last 10 years, I've been based in London as a reporter for The Guardian. And my job is to look at, it's really to look at the human impact of legislation that is that's designed in Westminster. So rather than following politics by sitting in the Houses of Parliament and listening to politicians, I'm looking at all of the new bits of policy that the government dreams up and going to kind of bits of the country and talking to people who are affected by the policy. So for the first kind of period of the the Conservative Liberal coalition, I was looking a lot at the kind of consequences of the austerity policies, looking at how cuts to council budgets caused difficulties. I was looking at changes to the NHS, a bit to education as well. So really interesting, because instead of talking to politicians, sorry, Catherine, I'm talking more to people who are affected by policies. And for the last 4 years, I've been looking much more closely at Home Office policies, looking first in detail at the situation with the kind of flow of refugees and migrants through France and Calais into Britain, and looking at a lot of the difficulties that people who were stuck in Calais in the camp there for years were facing. And then I've been looking really since 2017 in the autumn, really intensively at a problem that we know now as the Windrush problem, but which at the time was just a kind of really confusing story that I began to report on, kind of without really knowing what the problem was. So just to kind of remind you, it's a kind of really complex bit of a Home Office immigration disaster that happened over decades, but really happened kind of intensively when Theresa May was Home Secretary. So before she became Prime Minister, she was Home Secretary for, I think, 4 years, maybe 5 years. And she introduced a policy called the Hostile Environment Policy that introduced a series of measures that made people have to prove that they were living in the UK legally by producing documentary evidence saying that they had the right to live here. So before kind of 2012, there have always been checks on whether or not you've got the right to be in the UK legally. But on the whole, those checks only come when you come into the country by plane or by boat. Occasionally, when you start a new job, you were required to show your passport, but most of the time, it wasn't something that was kind of enforced really kind of closely. But from 2012 onwards, anybody who was getting a new mobile phone contract, trying to get a driving license, trying to rent a property, definitely starting to get a new job, trying to get free NHS healthcare, would be asked routinely whether or not they had the right to live in the UK legally. And what it exposed was that there were thousands of people who were living in the UK legally who weren't able to prove it. And those people were getting into huge difficulties. And for some reason that I still find really hard to explain, the difficulties that were being experienced by the Windrush generation happened quite intensively for kind of 5 years, but just never ever were reported on. So I started reporting on it towards the end of December 2017, when I was called by a charity in Wolverhampton who were really worried about somebody that they'd been trying to help to prove that she wasn't an illegal immigrant. And this was a woman called Paulette Wilson, who had come to Britain at the age of about 10 from Jamaica in 1968. She had come entirely legally. She'd come to live with her grandparents. Her grandmother was working for the NHS. And she'd lived from the age of 10 to the age of 61 in Britain without leaving the country. She'd had a daughter here, had a granddaughter here, had worked and had paid her taxes for decades. And suddenly in around 2015, she got a letter from the Home Office telling her that she was an illegal immigrant. And she tried for 2 years to explain to the Home Office that they'd made a mistake, but she wasn't able to prove to their satisfaction that she had in fact come here entirely legally in the 1960s. So by the time I was told about her, she had been twice arrested and she was locked up in Yarlswood Immigration Detention Centre and was scheduled to be deported back to Jamaica, which was a country where she had no relatives and that she hadn't visited for 50 years. So it was a really, really kind of peculiar case, really hard to understand. I went and interviewed her. Her MP actually had helped her to get out of Yarlswood, and her deportation was postponed. I interviewed her. We had a piece in The Guardian explaining what a kind of peculiar thing had happened. And everybody thought it was a mistake, like that the Home Office had made a really terrible mistake. But as soon as we published that piece in The Guardian, I began to have phone calls and emails from other people who'd had really similar difficult problems with the Home Office. So other people who had been locked up in detention centres for 5 weeks, other people who'd been sacked from their jobs because they'd been told that they were illegal immigrants, even though they'd been living in Britain totally legally for 50 years. People who had been told that they weren't eligible for NHS cancer treatment. So really, really kind of a whole range of very, very serious consequences for a group of people who had come to Britain entirely legally in the 1950s and the 1960s. And some people were wrongly deported back to countries that they had left 40, 50 years before. So I wrote pieces about that in The Guardian for about 6 months, and I was really, really frustrated because although I kept writing these pieces, we kept putting them in The Guardian, there was very, very little response from the Home Office and very little kind of government response. And Theresa May kind of swept it under the carpet, really. Said there might be a few people who've got problems with their immigration status, but they need to apply and sort it out, and they need to get legal help. And it was only really in April of 2018 when there was suddenly a group of Commonwealth politicians who come to London for a big kind of international summit of all of the 58, I think, Commonwealth countries in London, that the Caribbean leaders were upset about why it was that so many people who'd come from these former British colonies to Britain to live in the 1950s and 1960s were being told as they reached retirement age that they were illegal immigrants. And the Caribbean leaders said to Theresa May, you know, we need to have a meeting during the summit. And Downing Street said, we're really sorry, but the Prime Minister doesn't have time to meet you. And it was such a kind of terrible diplomatic snub. We reported it on the front of the page, on the front page of The Guardian. And within hours, the government was kind of so embarrassed that they apologised. They came to Parliament and they said they would do everything they could to give documentation to the thousands of people who had come from former colonies of Britain and who didn't have documentation, and they promised to pay compensation, and the Home Secretary resigned. So in the end, we got a kind of, we got a clear government response, but it did take a long time. And that is surprisingly something that I'm still working on 2 or 3 years on, because it's still kind of quite a messy situation. That's probably it, but really happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amelia. And some of you may have seen a series of short films over lockdown, one of which was a fantastic film based on Anthony Brown's life, which we can circulate later. And that's really worth watching over the summer. I think it might be set in Edmonton, actually. It might have been one of Kate Ossimer's cases.
It was one of her cases, yeah.
Yes, I thought so. Yeah. Right, I'll stop talking so that